Welcome to Women in Healthcare Leadership podcast series brought to you by Medscape Education. Our goal is to provide a platform where we can educate, advocate, and inspire women leaders to lift as they rise. With every episode, you'll hear from her as we showcase the perspectives, insights, and experiences of women who are leading the way in advancing women's health and empowering the next generation of women in healthcare.
Hello and welcome to Medscape's Women in Healthcare Leadership Series. I'm Karen Reid, a Senior Director at Medscape Education. I'd like to welcome my guest today. First, Dr. Sandra Milligan, the Head of Research and Development at Organon, a global healthcare company focused on women's health. Welcome, Sandy.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
And I'm also delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jennifer Gedkin, Associate Professor of Gynecology and Obstetrics at Emory University School of Medicine in the United States. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Karen.
So thank you both for joining today. There's a lot we'd like to talk about, but I wanted to start our conversation to talk a little bit about your career and personal journey. So Sandy, let's start with you. What prompted you to go into a career in medicine and in women's health?
Thanks for that question. I would say that my journey's been a little bit nonlinear, but I started out in college really interested in biology and physiology and disease intervention, which led me to obtaining a degree in medical sciences. So I was a general medical physician for several years, but I was also really interested in what the legal construct of healthcare systems and healthcare delivery is, as well as some of the business aspects of healthcare. And so went back to law school and achieved a law degree. So then I practiced law for a bit, some venture capital financing, mergers and acquisitions, and healthcare law. And that eventually evolved to an interest in biopharma research. And so I was fortunate enough about 2 decades ago to enter into the biopharma field, where I've had different positions in the R&D, the research and development side of the house. And so that's led me to where I am today. It's been a great journey.
Thank you, Sandy. And Jennifer, I'd also like to ask you, what motivated you to become a physician and to go into the field of women's health?
Yes, thank you. To start with, I probably went to university with an idea that I wanted to be in medicine, but I wasn't totally convinced. Took a break after university and went off to the Peace Corps, and then kept that little niggle in the back of my head about trying to go to medical school, and made my way there, loved every minute of it, and was one of those medical students that fell in love with every rotation I did. But I have to say, I loved being in the OR, and I really found working on labor and delivery fascinating. All the levels of, I would say, some of the more socially charged issues that women deal with, generally speaking, whether it has to do with contraception or family planning decisions, reproductive health care, all those things actually really resonated also with my general interests and sort of advocacy. And so that's where I landed, and it was a great place for me. And I've just gone from there and been really focused still in medicine. I didn't take as many turns as Sandy did, still doing medicine, but very focused in education, primarily in ethics.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you for sharing that. I'm always so curious to know what inspired people in their careers. So I wanted to ask you both now about the fields of women's health, and what are the biggest gaps that exist today, and how can we address some of those gaps to ensure that women can receive equitable care?
Yeah, I can start because I'll start with the basic research, and then maybe Jenny can pull through there to the application and practice. So I think one of the biggest gaps that we're seeing is just a real lack of investment in the basic research around women's biology and physiology. And what that leads to is a lack of understanding of targets of disease modification. And so I think oftentimes, historically, over the past few decades, we've been resorting to measures of upregulating or downregulating hormones when it comes to some of the more women-specific diseases, diseases unique to women, if you will. So I think that there needs to be broader investment in that early research to identify those disease targets and the biology behind them, and then also start to develop measures of biomarkers, for instance, and then also thinking about how we can create medications or therapies that can intervene at that specific molecular level in a specific targeted way. That'll take a couple of decades of research. Honestly, I feel like we're a little bit behind almost where oncology was 20 years ago and neuroscience was about 10 years ago. But women, clearly being half the population and a very important component of our society and economy and family structure, we really need to make this investment for women to move their health forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Sandy more. I will say research is probably where we lack the most, particularly, I'll say, actually in patients that are pregnant. So, research done in pregnant patients is almost unheard of. I think we're sort of changing the pendulum on that and starting to look at obstetrical patients and patients that are pregnant on not being necessarily as taboo and untouchable. But that is really critical. Patients that are sick get pregnant and patients get sick when they're pregnant. And so we need to be able to care for them and not literally sometimes make them suffer through pregnancy only because we don't have enough data to feel comfortable treating their diseases. I also agree completely with Sandy and think, just as an example, I'll say that as it has to do with sexual functioning. So I see an awful lot of perimenopausal and postmenopausal women that come to me for what we would designate female sexual arousal disorders and the such. There's almost nothing I can offer them because there's almost nothing that has been researched at all in comparison to our male counterparts. And the other thing I'll add more on a clinical aspect, which is just the unequal compensation for women's healthcare versus men's healthcare. For instance, surgeries done for pelvic organ prolapse or primarily bladder-related issues like incontinence, surgeries that are equivalent, basically, between men and women are compensated at very different levels. So you have gynecological or urogynecological surgeons doing surgery similar to their urological partners that are caring primarily for male patients, and they are actually able to bill for and charge more for those surgeries than we are in gynecology. So those sorts of disparities really marginalize women's healthcare in general.
Thank you, Jenny, for sharing that. I'm just curious, why do we think that there's been such a lack of investment? Sandy, you talked about the lack of investment in women's health. What do you think are the reasons historically for that?
I think there's a few. I think that as most women have probably experienced in their time, some medical conditions or just phases of life are considered just part of life. Let's talk about menopause, for example. So for many, many women, the symptomatology of menopause is really difficult and challenging. And we have now we have two options, but primarily we've had a singular hormonal replacement therapy option for many decades. Unfortunately, there had been a study that was done, 20 plus years ago that dampened the enthusiasm from both patients and physicians in the utilization of HRT. And that left with women just suffering with the symptoms because it was just part of life. And I think for many of the conditions that women experience, it's just considered part of being a woman. But unfortunately, women are now taking such an economic and political and role in the community. I don't think women can sit in the dark with a hot water bottle on their abdomen and keep moving. And we really need to have solutions that enable women to be everything they are meant to be, whether it's in the economic world, the cultural world, their families. And I think what's really been lacking is not just the innovation, but also the access. And when I think of access, I think of, from a pharmaceutical perspective, the lack of innovation in the regulatory pathways to get some of the new innovations out to be approved to the market. And then also the lack of choice. And I think for many years, there's been limited choice for women in some of the options. For instance, for endometriosis, it's a dilemma which option you actually choose as you progress in your disease symptoms, and there's consequences, right? So we need better therapies that have a more balanced risk and benefit for women, and we need to increase the access by regulatory pathways that are thoughtful and the ability to choose. So having payer financed remedies that we can provide patients, and then also with women, just depending on what their background is or what their preference is, having more than one option. Because when you only have one option, you really have no choice at all.
I will just add, if it's okay, Karen, that I think part of it has also to do with who is in the room when decisions are being made about funding for research and development, right? So I think the reality is, if most of the people in the room making those decisions are men, it's not a surprise when decisions are made to focus on medications that address men. And so I think that's part of it too, just from the get-go. And I completely agree with everything else that Sandy said.
So you make a good point, Jenny, there about, more women in the room, and maybe more women in leadership and across the healthcare system will help to drive that and to really maybe lead to better healthcare outcomes for women. So pulling on that thread then and looking at women in leadership, what do you think are the barriers that exist today for women progressing into leadership roles?
Well, I'll just sort of reiterate what I already said, which was I don't think there's enough women in leadership roles as an example to women. And so I think that's been an issue, certainly an issue in my life. I hope that's changing. And so I think people need to be able to look up at the head table and see people that look like themselves, even just to have the idea in their head that that could be them someday. I think there's a lack of mentorship, and maybe even more important as it pertains to, say, businesses or enterprises, is advocacy. You need to have an advocate. So when it comes down to a position that opens up, you need to have somebody that thinks about you as possibly being that person to put into that spot. So mentorship's important. I think we might have a chance to talk more about that, but I think actual advocates are really important to have. And I think people tend to advocate for, I think it's an internal bias, for people that look like them, that they can resonate with, they identify with. And so I think that's one big issue. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention sort of the self-imposed and probably a societally imposed issue of trying to balance a family. So not all women want to have a family, but many do. And the idea of balancing a family can be much more challenging despite all the progress we've made. I think most people still look to the woman as being the primary caretaker for children. I can give you an examples when I was going on business trips of how many of my own female colleagues would ask me, who's watching the kids? And I thought, you've met my husband. There is another partner in this, right? And that might not be the case for everybody. It was still so interesting to me to see still what a bias that my own colleagues had about women in these roles and how we balance family and work.
And I think there's been some early representatives of women in really powerful positions across the fields, right? Not just medicine or science. And I think, I look forward to the day where you turn to the left and you turn to the right, and there's two women sitting next to you in equally powerful positions. I think for those first pioneers, sometimes I can't imagine how hard and challenging it must have been, because every move they make was scrutinized and any misstep they took was penalized. And so what I'm looking forward to is having more and more women in the C-suites or C-suites plus one in the different, whether it's a medical establishment, a pharma research, what have you, because as when a gentleman makes a misstep, there's plenty other gentlemen around him, and it kind of dilutes the effect. But it's too easy to be kind of that beacon, if you will, of missteps. And so I think that as more women get into leadership positions, I think it'll become more naturalized that is the rightful place that they've earned, that there's a level of respect and trust that comes with that seat.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think it's maybe a case of some women possibly ruling themselves out or just not putting themselves forward enough?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think many people feel that way. And in fact, I had a chairman tell me early in my career that you can't become a chairperson or a leader in a healthcare position if you want to have a family. And that was a woman who had, in her own case, foregone having a family. That's what she chose to do at that time, because she chose her career over family. And so there wasn't an idea that you could balance it. So I would say, at least from my generation, that's true. I hope that's not how the younger generation sees it. I don't think it has to be this versus that. I think you can have both.
Yeah. And then, so on that theme of kind of closing the gaps, and Jenny, you talked about mentorship. How important is mentorship or sponsorship, or what is the difference between the two?
Yeah. So I would say mentorship, well, both of them are critical and probably something that I underestimated, and something that someone might not automatically get. So there's much more of a focus on mentorship now, and there's many programs within, whether it's academic departments or businesses, where they actually pair you up with a mentor. That may work. Oftentimes it doesn't. And so what I would recommend to people is that they find mentorship. They go looking for it. And it might not happen in your own nuclear surrounding. You might need to go to, in the case of me, I had to go outside to another department or outside medicine altogether and found some mentorship with colleagues and friends in the community and in business and other groups. So I think it's important to look for mentorship in areas you might not otherwise think about. And I also would say what has been very helpful in my life has been peer mentorship. So while it's really wonderful to be able to glean advice from someone older that sort of walked the road and walked the path, I think there's a lot of support and guidance that we can give each other as peers. And so I actually have found peer mentorship to be very important and helpful.
I love that. I think that's great advice, Jenny. And just to be mindful that sometimes our mentors are around us, as you said, in terms of a peer mentorship, and to be cognizant of that. Sandy, have you any comments on mentorship?
Absolutely. So, just following up and supporting Jenny's comments, I think with mentorship and sponsorship, what we see bringing to the or brought to the table from women leaders in my biopharma sector is that women have a broader shared experience instead of a singular subject matter expertise, and I think that comes from their ability to network with a variety of people and mentors. And I do that now for certain topics or certain challenges that I'm facing. There will be a different set of mentors. If I need support in a certain other decision making, I'll talk to a different mentor or support system. So I think that women just naturally have the ability to reach out and really form a broad network. And I think that the younger generation, men or women, do a disservice to themselves if they pick a mentor, right? And they think that that single mentor is going to be enough. I think that I think of it as a smorgasbord, a buffet of intellect, of experience, and of guidance. And so having multiple mentors or sponsors throughout the way, I think is really important. Sponsorship to me is when someone really does take a chance on you, right? They think about your experience in your education, and they think, well, you may be that square peg in the round hole because you don't squarely fit with the parameters of the job description. But you know what? I'm going to take my chance on you because I think your capabilities are there. You may not have the the exact right experience, but you have the know-how, the leadership, the management capabilities, strategic analytical thinking, whatever it might be. And I think you can be successful in this role. So for me, it's about pulling someone up and over you and providing that opportunity where someone else can take a risk on your next role.
I love that, Sandy. I think that's great about really, removing barriers as a leader. So I wanted to ask you both now about your experience in becoming female leaders. Did you face any particular challenges along your path? Are there any things that really resonated with you, lessons learned?
The answer is yes. I would say the idea and the struggle of balancing family for me was a real one. I also, and I think perhaps women in general are a little more guilty of this. I found myself regularly sort of devaluing my contributions and my time. And so I think what's true, and this is not genderized, but what's true is if you're capable and you can get the job done, you'll get more added to your plate. And what can oftentimes happen, though, is if you don't stop and say, all right, I have too much on my plate. I can't do all this. And, or I need more, in my case, protected time to do this. My salary should look like, and my time should be divided like some of my other colleagues because I'm taking this on. And so those are ways that I did a disservice to myself, and frankly, did a disservice to my younger colleagues. And I have openly shared that, with them. Like, don't undersell yourselves, don't undersell your time, and don't take on more than you can do well. I think those are things that I have learned to do, and I think that's something that I have noticed my female colleagues and myself are a little more apt to do, and not always. And it's not about credit. So, just for an example, our department didn't have a vice chair of education position for years. Um, Myself and others sort of did that job, but there never was that equal position in our department because education, which fell mostly to more of the women in our department, or were the ones that had the interest in it, it wasn't valued as much. And so that's where a disconnect was, just as a very specific example.
Yeah, and for me, I think initially when I took a leadership role, I think the expectation from myself was that I needed to appear as a superwoman, right? Just this incredible, had it all together, all the answers to all the different challenges, seamless juggle of family and work. And what you realize pretty quickly is, there are days where, especially when my children were younger, there were days where I was a phenomenal employee. I was up early, I was in the office, I worked all day. Those were the last kids to be picked up at night, brought them home, tucked them in. And so I was a superwoman at work, right? But not necessarily, where I wanted to be as a mom. But then there were other days, and I had to juggle these days where I was a great mom, right? You took the time off, you went to the kindergarten graduation, you did whatever you needed to do. And what I realized pretty quickly is to be a role model, I needed to demonstrate and reflect the priorities in my own life. So some days, and those priorities are not always the same day. Some days it's family first. Some days it's work first, depending on what the demands are. And I think the other part about prioritization and role modeling is also modeling when I need help. Let me give you an example. Just recently, my mom broke her hip and she lives across town. And unlike before, when my kids were young, I've been very transparent about the fact that I need to be her assistant, to be her advocate, her caretaker, and I need more time to prioritize her. So unexpected from my workers, right? They're like, "Well, wait a minute. I thought you had everything kind of put together and buttoned up." Well, I did until this happened. And so I think being transparent about what my needs are, they of course were very accepting of it and given me the flexibility and the headspace, to move my mom through and to get her back on her feet. So I think it's around role modeling appropriately, role modeling your priorities and role modeling your strengths and your weaknesses. When do you need help?
Right. I'll just interject to say, as the woman, you were the primary caretaker, it sounds like, for your mother. And that's actually a statistic, right? Women are far and away primary caretakers for their families. And that's a reality. So that's a good point, Sandy.
They're great examples you both shared. And I think even when I think of my life, my role, it is a tricky balance trying to, you want to succeed professionally, but you also have to manage that balance. So I just wanted to ask you now, for young women entering the field, what advice would you give them? We talked a lot about balance, but is there any other nuggets of advice that you would share? Or what do we really need to think about to compel those young women on to want to move into leadership?
Yeah, I'll just start by saying, because I thought about this a bit, and I think we have already said a lot on this topic, actually, but I would say to make sure that you build yourself a community. So we talked about it from the career standpoint. Find mentorship, whether it's peer mentorship, a smorgasbord of mentors, as Sandy mentioned, but you need to do that at the home level too. You need to have those neighbors, those friends, those people you can count on or call on when work is overwhelming you and you can't get there to pick up your children and you don't want them to have memories of being left on the corner or what have you. You need to build the community both at home and in your career.
And I would add that I think that, the days of, oh, I'm going to enter this institution and I'm going to come out 35 years later with my pension, those days are gone. And I think as anyone enters into a profession, they have to not only adapt to change that may happen with the institution that they're working with, but they have to understand when they need a change, right? So whether it's a change in capabilities by upskilling and taking additional educational courses, for instance, if it is changing an environment for a better opportunity, if it's changing a behavior, a leadership behavior based on feedback, I think it's really important that it's not just change management of experiencing change that happens to you. It's also recognizing when you need to change and how you affect those around you as they are progressing through that change as well.
So that brings me to my last question about the future. I'm curious to know what both of you are most excited about when it comes to the future of women's health.
Yeah, I will just say, as somebody who still is very much in touch with the medical school world and seeing the young people coming into medicine these days, quite frankly, looking out in the auditorium as I did just about a month and a half ago, giving a lecture to a bunch of second-year medical students, I can't tell you how exciting it was to see so many young women, which has been the case for the past few years. There are more women going into medical school than men at this point by a smidge, but also just the diversity. So many brown and Black people that was just never the case at the institutions I was at before. It's so heartwarming to see the diversity that we're seeing in healthcare.
And I would agree. I think in some of the conferences that I am able to attend, especially investor conferences, entrepreneur conferences, it's exciting to see women leaders and diverse leaders move forward, taking innovation and moving it to companies for further assessment and development and investment. And it's amazing to see the young women and women of color who are moving forward to CEO, CFO, chief science officer positions, and really having an impact on that ecosystem, bringing forward the different innovations. As well, I'm excited by the number of women-led venture capital funds that help seed the technology that are really going to improve women's lives. And so I think that it's wonderful that we see investment funds that are led by, run by, or influenced by women and women's health. So I think that there's a lot of green shoots of excitement, especially in the early sciences, and whether it could be biopharma, it could be device, it could be a digital therapeutic or a new diagnostic. I think there's areas where women are starting to touch every stage of innovation.
Right. So I think that's a great place to bring our conversation to a close today. I absolutely loved our discussion here, and I cannot thank you both enough for sharing what you've learned as leaders. As I reflect on our conversation today, while there are gaps in women's health, there is some progress being made, and there are green shoots on the horizon. And in terms of women in leadership, you both shared some great advice and insights that will help to guide and elevate other women. So thank you both for participating today. I also want to thank all of our listeners who joined, and please stay tuned for the next episode of our Women in Healthcare Leadership series. Thank you both.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Tune in next week as we continue our journey to amplify the voices of women leaders in pharma and medicine. Hear From Her is brought to you by Medscape Education. Please subscribe to Hear From Her on your preferred podcast channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Until next week, remember to lift as you rise.